Hey, I'm Chris Brannock, the priest in charge at St. Patrick's in Somerset, Kentucky. And I wanted to give just the intro to a Book of Common Prayer and how it is used in the Episcopal Church. So I want to begin with the idea that, or an understanding that in the early church, and by that I'm really referring to the first 4, 5, 6 centuries, there was nothing terribly normative except within local communities for how we would worship. Our earliest document, or perhaps one of the earliest documents we have, a manual on how to do things liturgically, was called the Didache, and that comes from anywhere from 60 AD to the early part of the 2nd century, so around 110. But that, I just want to use that as a preface that we had a good long period in Christianity where our worship was not normative and or consistent except within local regions or local communities. That's just my background. So I want to get into the history just briefly of the English Church. And the first Book of Common Prayer that was issued in English came in the year 1549 under the rule of King Edward VI. Thomas Cranmer, who was at that point the Archbishop of Canterbury, proposed in the year 1548 that he put together with a group of scholars what came to be the first English edition in English of the Book of Common Prayer, and that was published and used for the first time on Pentecost or Whitsunday, June 9th, 1549. In that, it contained the daily offices, the sacraments, the Psalter, and other various administrations of the sacraments within the life of the church. That was quickly revised within 3 years in 1552, again under the reign of Edward VI. And then when Elizabeth I assumed the throne, she issued the 1559 Book of Common Prayer. The background for all of those, I'm going to go back to Cranmer, was that there were Latin services in Latin that were used. It was essentially a medieval rite that we call the Sarum, S-A-R-U-M, rite that came out of Salisbury, the diocese. And so we had the Latin versions that were around, and Cranmer also referred to earlier authors, in particular St. Augustine. But in 1549, Elizabeth I issued the third version of the prayer book. Each one of those editions, the 1549, the 1552, the 1559, and then ultimately that served through until the end of the 16th century, and then eventually the 1662 edition, which remained in use until the 20th century. All 4 of those, each one came with an Act of Parliament that we call the Act of Uniformity, which in a sense guaranteed or encouraged or penalized those that did not, that were worshiping that did not conform to the liturgy as it was laid out in those 4 books of common prayer. So 1549, 1552, 1559, and 1662. And as I said, all of them laid out what was intended to be used by the clergy and the people We have what we call the daily offices, meaning that they were intended to be prayed every single day, morning and evening prayer. The Psalter, consisting of 150 psalms, was intended to be used over a 30-day period, or monthly. You would read through the entire Psalter. There were the sacraments of Holy Communion, baptism, confirmation, marriage, reconciliation, a funny one called the Churching of Women, which was the based upon the Feast of the Purification, a woman after childbirth, ordination, consecration of a bishop, and also the administration of last rites or holy unction. When we get to the American church, our first prayer book came to us in the year 1789 under the direction of one of the first American bishops, Samuel Seabury. And that prayer book, the 1789 prayer book, basically was our version based upon the Scottish prayer book of 1764. There are some differences. That prayer book was revised in 1892, and then in 1928, which is the prayer book that I grew up on, and then in 1979, which is this book that we are using at St. Patrick's. The title of it is The Book of Common Prayer and Administration of the Sacraments and Other Rites and Ceremonies of the Church, together with the Psalter or the Psalms of David, according to the use of the Episcopal Church. Going back to our first prayer book in this country, under the direction of Samuel Seabury, one of the things that was kind of interesting just from a historical perspective is that in the year 1604 in England, Parliament created something that they called the Oath of Allegiance that all clergy had to make on the occasion of their ordination, where they professed their allegiance to the crown. Now, as you can imagine, for those in the colonies in the United States, this became increasingly problematic, especially after the Revolutionary War, which took place 1765 to 1783. We had a division within the members of our churches in the colonies, because we either had the loyalists who remained loyal to the crown in England, or those that were in favor of the revolution. And after the revolution, it literally became impossible for any clergy to take that oath of allegiance without literally getting into hot water in this country. So you will not see any oath of allegiance in the ordination rites in our 1789 prayer book. So that's just kind of that is in a nutshell the very brief history of a Book of Common Prayer. But if you could just kind of step back and look at it, one of the questions that frequently is asked for someone who is coming to a Catholic-minded church, a sacramental church, a church that has a regularized liturgy, one of the questions that will come up is, this doesn't seem very prayerful to me because you're reading prayers. The whole notion behind common prayer is that we would unite in our hearts and minds, our souls, and be using the same liturgy as close as we could throughout the entire world. Now, I do realize that there are implications of colonization, etc., But this was an attribute of Catholicism, that that we would have a common mind. And part of this is dictated by the fact that we use a calendar of lessons. We follow what we call the lectionary, and that is set out in the Book of Common Prayer. At every general convention, we have to vote on whether we add various people to the calendar of saints, but our feast days remain true, and they're kind of our compass of how we read through the calendar year. So I'm going to stop here, but that is my just brief introduction. Next week in our Inquirers class, we will begin going through the prayer book in much, much greater depth. But that's just the background of how we got to the 1979 Book of Common Prayer.